Welcome. I'm Catherine Fitzgerald Wyatt, the Education and Outreach Manager here at the library, and we are just delighted to do a day-long symposium celebrating the work of House to Highway, Reclaiming a Community History in partnership with the Jackson Project. Today's presenters will be exploring themes highlighted in the exhibition, and I wanted to run through the schedule briefly with you. We will begin this morning with presentations from Calvin Schermerhorn, Professor of History at Arizona State University and author of The Plunder of Black America, followed by Warren Milteer, Associate Professor of History at George Washington University and author of Beyond Slavery's Shadow, Free People of Color in the South, and then John Finn, Associate Professor of Geography and Chair of the Department of Sociology, Social Work, and Anthropology at Christopher Newport University. And so then we're going to break for lunch. After lunch, additional sessions will include a presentation on historic preservation led by LaToya Gray Sparks, the Community Outreach Coordinator for the Department of Historic Resources. And we will wrap up the day with a discussion on grassroots historic preservation efforts moderated by historian Greg Kimball with Viola Baskerville, former Virginia Secretary of Administration and former member of the Virginia House of Delegates, Anna Edwards, public historian and assistant professor of African American history at Virginia Commonwealth University, and Sisha Joy Moon, co-founder and executive director of the Jackson Project. We also have a schedule board where you registered. There are also printed flyers with the schedule if you need a refresher. I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Calvin Schermerhorn to give the keynote, Jackson Ward's Reversal of Fortune. Calvin grew up in Southern Maryland, and after graduate degrees at Harvard Divinity School and the University of Virginia, he became a historian of slavery, capitalism, and African American inequality. He teaches courses in 19th century American history, including the Civil War and Reconstruction, and advises honors, masters, and PhD students. He was a Fulbright Scholar to the University of Nottingham in 2022. He has contributed to The Atlantic, The Daily Beast, Time, and The Washington Post, among other popular venues, and his work has been featured in national discussions of racial inequality. He is the author of 4 books on American slavery and inequality, including The Plunder of Black America, How the Racial Wealth Gap Was Made, which was published by Yale University Press in 2025. And before I hand it over to Calvin, I just wanted to share 2 upcoming events with you here at the library. On Tuesday, October 28th, we are going to welcome Michael Twitty, who will be discussing his new book, Recipes from the American South, in conversation with culinary historian Lenny Sorensen. And on Wednesday, November 5th, the library will host a virtual book talk with Dr. Kathleen Duvall on her latest award-winning book, Native Nations, A Millennium in North America. So please check our calendar of events for other upcoming programs, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Calvin Schermerhorn.
Thank you, Catherine. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'd like to share the story today of theft. We usually think about piracy or robbery as a violent act, and it's true. Some of this theft was violent, it was loud, but some of it was quiet, and that's the subtlety. So I want to start by asking you, in the United States today, what is the racial wealth gap between black households and white households? Anyone know this information? Any guesses, speculation? 80%. 80%. I wish, okay? Any other thoughts, any other kind of educated guesses on this? So in 2022, the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer... Sorry. In 2022, the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances found out that the typical black household has 16 cents on the dollar compared to the typical white household. So let's keep that in mind as we think back 200 or so years in Richmond, Virginia. So Black Virginians, of course, did seek land to build homes of their own, to build wealth, to unlock the doors of opportunity. Of course, at the time of its founding, 9 in 10 African Americans was enslaved. Or to put it in the active voice, white Virginians enslaved 9 in 10 African Americans around the founding. That began to change with people like Abraham Peyton Skipworth, born enslaved in Williamsburg around 1785. He earned his freedom, he paid for it. He also managed to acquire property in what would become Jackson Ward in 1793. And so after he died in 1797, the Skipworth-Roper College passed down to black owners. So there is a pattern, right, of wealth accumulation and passing this down. Now, Skipworth was a pioneer. And the place that became Jackson Ward was a fertile ground for African-American success. Others like Skipworth claimed an economic state in a city on the rise, but the odds were long against success. In 1860, right before the Civil War, as you can see, the wealth gap estimated by Laura de Renoncourt, professor of economics, was about 56-1, right? So functionally that meant that the typical black household had 2 cents on the dollar compared to the typical white household. With emancipation came opportunity, but it was a steep climb on that ladder. Black Richmonders largely rebuilt the city that Confederates had burned in 1865, and Richmond's black population was immersed in the pursuits of happiness. They wanted a fair economic shake and a say in political issues. Of course, we know that didn't go smoothly. Even in post-war Richmond, black customers tended to pay more for the goods and services that were on offer than whites. Insurance companies, it was completely legal for them to refuse to provide insurance, to underwrite black lives. It was perfectly legal for landlords to charge higher rents. And so black Richmonders had a tough time getting legal counsel, medical, dental care, and the doors of many schools and civic organizations were closed. Yet by 1870, the year that Virginia rejoined the Union under the 14th Amendment, the racial wealth gap had halved between 1860 and 1870. So now it was down to 23-1. So for every dollar owned by a white household nationally, a black household had 4 cents. Politics, of course, changed too. After emancipation, black Virginians joined the party of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. Republicans in the 1860s, remember, were the liberal party that believed in active government, that wanted to protect a vision of multiracial democracy, at least tentatively. Ulysses S. Grant's election in 1868 relied on black voters, right? But recall, what was Richmond the capital of before 1865? The Confederacy, okay. And the ex-Confederates, of course, weren't convinced by defeat, right? It didn't change hearts and minds. And so by the time of Virginia's 1868 Constitution that enfranchised black men, there were conflicting forces. So Richmond's all-white city council in 1871 created a gerrymandered 6th district, a 6th ward. It had captured enough black Richmonders to create a kind of a black plurality district, even though what became Jackson Ward, or what was Jackson Ward at the time, was fairly well integrated. And you see on the map there, I'm going to step away from the microphone. Right? We know the outlines, right? We know the general outlines of Jackson Ward. So the neighborhoods contained in there sprouted grocery stores, retail goods, dry goods stores, barbershops, boarding houses, small hotels for black travelers, livery stables and wagon services, saloons and restaurants, tailors and dressmakers, shoemakers and blacksmiths, and so on. So this became kind of a hub of the business community and the social community there. And there's a little bit of a detail of Jackson Ward in the late 19th century. And so the changes were made possible, of course, by leaders, people like Josiah Crump. He worked as a teamster and a postal clerk, became active in the Republican Party, and joined the Grand Fountain United Order of True Reformers. He captained one of Richmond's black militias, which provided protection to black residents against competing militias, and formed neighborhood watches. So Crump won a seat on the city's Board of Aldermen in 1876, served on and off until his death in 1890. He served on the Committee of Ordinances, which was rare for a black council member, and ended the practice of medical schools robbing graves for black cadavers. They could have a whole session on that practice. Thank you, UVA Medical School, right? William Washington Brown founded and organized the Grand Fountain in Richmond in January of 1881. So this Grand Fountain of the United Order of True Reformers was an African-American fraternal organization. It became the largest and most successful black business enterprise in the United States between 1881 and 1910. So born enslaved, Brown served in the Union Army. During the war, became a Methodist minister and teacher. And his vision expanded the Grand Fountain into an enterprise that cultivated a growing black middle class by offering services, offering credit. He opened a savings bank, a real estate company, a retirement home, a youth and children's division that taught discipline, thrift, and business schools. And so you can see what's happening there. As the Richmond City Council, as White Richmond is trying to box the black population into this ward, these leaders are providing the services that are often off limits in white institutions. And by the 1890s, Jackson Ward was thriving. Its black-owned businesses, banks, insurance companies, newspapers, and professional offices brought services to African Americans. Racial segregation led to a parallel economy in Richmond. It was an uneven parallel, right, but a parallel economy nonetheless, one in which black-owned businesses serving black customers thrived. So the Southern Aid Insurance Company, founded in 1893, was one of the South's earliest black-owned insurance firms. So why is that important? Just to pause there. Why is a process like that important of insurance companies, banks, professionals, services? Just one thought on that from the audience. Right. I'm sorry, one more? Collective economy, correct, right? So if you need these services and they're off limits among white-owned institutions, right? So you build your own institutions. But of course, we're gonna see the limits of that shortly. The Grand Fountain of the United Order of True Reformers was headquartered in Jackson Ward. It was the first chartered black-owned bank in the United States, was the True Reformers Bank. It offered savings, mortgages, and insurance. And so recall, at the time, the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company had already failed, right? The Freedmen's Bank had already failed, and that had taken a large portion of black wealth with it, although in the bankruptcy, they managed to pay out 60 cents on the dollar, something like that. So when it failed, it also broke the trust of black Americans nationwide, who just saw this as an engine of corruption. And if you hadn't already, please read Justine Hill Edwards' recent excellent book, Savings and Trust, The Rise and Betrayal of the Freedmen's Bank, that tells the story in loving detail. So as Jackson Ward's developed, they developed insurance, banking, professional services, and also the Richmond Planet, founded in 1882. It was the city's leading black newspaper, edited by John Mitchell Jr., a pioneering journalist and civil rights leader. He fought lynching and segregation through the paper. He was born enslaved near Richmond, attended the Richmond Colored Normal School, taught for a year before he and other black teachers were fired by a Democratic school board. He went back into journalism, and by 1884, he was the fighting editor of the Planet. And he also served on the Richmond City Council from 1888 to 1896 before founding the Mechanics Savings Bank in 1901. It closed in 1922. He faced trumped-up charges of fraud and theft, but he ran for governor as a black Republican and remained editor of the Planet until his death in 1929. So what's happening along the way in the larger picture? By 1900, you can see the racial wealth gap, the black-white racial wealth gap, had narrowed to about 11 to 1. So we're still talking about 10 cents on the dollar or so, or 9 cents on the dollar. It's still a gaping gap, but it's narrowing. Here's a thought experiment. If the racial wealth gap continued to close at the rate of 2.2%, the way it had in the 1870s and 1880s and 1890s, it would have taken 108 years from 1900 to close the gap. So in 2008, when Barack Obama was elected president, right, we should have seen parity, right? Not 80%, right, 100%. So why didn't that happen? What's holding people back? Why does that graph seem to get stuck? Well, here's part of the story. But wait, in the meantime, not all of Richmond's business community, of course, was male, right? So Maggie Lena Walker was the first black woman in the United States to found a bank. As a teen, Maggie Mitchell joined the local council of the Independent Order of St. Luke, a fraternal burial society established in 1867 in Baltimore. She served on the board of trustees for several women's groups. Among them were the National Association of Colored Women, the Virginia Institute School for Girls. She served as a member of the Virginia Interracial Commission. She established a newspaper, the St. Luke Herald, to promote closer communication between the order and the public. In speeches, Walker said, "Let us put our money together. Let us use our money. Let us put our money out at usury among ourselves and reap the benefit ourselves." So in 1903, she founded the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank, served as the bank's first president, which earned her recognition as being the first African-American woman to charter a bank in the United States. She encouraged black families to pool their resources, to emphasize that pennies and nickels could add up to significant success. She offered financial literacy, accepted small deposits, and helped to build a stable financial foundation for the community. So here's a bank, right, that part of its mission wasn't just to, transaction fees and all that. They're accepting small deposits. They're accepting nickels and pennies, saying, you start that now, it's going to grow, right? It's going to blossom into wealth that you can invest in housing, you can invest in education, pass down to your children. The bank issued mortgages and personal loans to black families and businesses. Again, I'm emphasizing this a lot because this is the obstacle, right? How do you get the money to buy a house, to buy those business? And most mortgages in this day and age were what we call balloon mortgages. So you had to put 50% down, pay interest only for a few years, and then the rest of it came due, right? So it's the financial technology that we rely on came a little bit later, and that's part of the story too. So she believed in recycling the black dollar, right, in community kind of investment. And this was happening all over the South. As states like South Carolina and Oklahoma instituted segregation, this became a fertile ground for a black middle class, whether in Greenwood, part of Tulsa, Jacksonville, Florida, North Charleston, South Carolina. You see this happening over and over again. So Walker steered the bank until it eventually merged and formed the Consolidated Bank and Trust Company. Its doors were open until 2009. But black capitalism met the headwinds of decapitalization and disenfranchisement. In 1902, Virginia had another constitutional convention. It was late to the game of stripping rights from African Americans. Many other states had done this before, including South Carolina in 1895. Carter Glass, a newspaper editor and politician from Lynchburg, Virginia. Have you ever heard of the Glass-Steagall Act, preventing certain kinds of banking, right? This is that Glass. So he expressed the kind of consensus opinion in that convention that the purpose was, in quotes, the elimination of every Negro who can be gotten rid of legally without materially impairing the strength of the white electorate. So the whole Constitution was meant to disenfranchise, well, not the whole Constitution, but the point of it was to disenfranchise black voters with poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and other means of disenfranchisement. And they borrowed this from Mississippi, and they borrowed this from South Carolina. And this Constitution was successful in disenfranchising about 90% of would-be black voters. John Mitchell Jr. used the planet to promote civil rights and racial justice and racial pride, and he and Maggie Walker played an instrumental role in organizing the Richmond streetcar boycott of 1904. The Virginia Passenger and Power Company, which operated the city's streetcars, decided to segregate them. And so here's a pushback. And then the city killed Jackson Ward in 1905. So it said, well, if you can't vote anyway, then why should Jackson Ward exist? So the forces of decapitalization gathered to plunder Black Richmonders of their assets and their homes and businesses. In 1911, the Richmond City Council passed an ordinance ensuring the, in quotes, strict domiciliary segregation of the white and the colored population. Supreme Court disagreed with that. They ruled that kind of blatant race-based segregation was unconstitutional in 1917. So in Richmond in 1924 adopted an ordinance based on Virginia's Racial Integrity Act that prohibited residents living in a neighborhood where they were not permitted to marry a member of the majority population. So the forces of American apartheid are looking for loopholes in these laws to accomplish the same thing. And so since it was illegal in Virginia for white and black spouses to marry, or people to marry, well, it didn't matter. The court struck down that apartheid measure as well. But real estate practices accomplished what unconstitutional laws could not. And that's the key to understanding Jackson Ward's decapitalization in the 20th century. So all over the country, builders, property owners, and homeowners associations wrote racial restrictions into deeds and covenants. And these were kind of insidious, right? You're about to buy a home, you get the deed, and then there in the fine print it says, this property shall be occupied, owned solely by members of the white race for a period of 99 years. Oh, you can have a live-in maid, right, or a nanny or servants on the property, but they can't own or rent. And so once you got that into the deeds, then community organizations, HOAs, property owners organizations can leverage that into segregating neighborhoods and building walls around white wealth. And Richmond's black population, or the proportion of black residents, fell. In 1900, Richmond was 38% black. By 1924, it was 30%. So what does that mean? That means that the city's gates are closing. Richmond is a place where, yes, you can go to find work and opportunity. And so once you start to segregate those neighborhoods, close off that gate, people stop coming in. A 1926 study of black Virginians' housing found that in Richmond, 39% of households owned and 61% rented. I'm not quite there yet. In 2020, the figures were slightly better. 48% of black Richmonders owned and 52% rented. But that hides the fact that 72% of white households in Greater Richmond own, right? So there's this huge disparity. Something else was happening alongside this, and that is landlords and real estate professionals cornered black Richmonders into small neighborhood enclaves. It was like an apartheid python constricted the black neighborhoods. So what do you think happened to rental prices in those neighborhoods? They went up, right? So you're creating an artificial scarcity with segregation. And notice this is happening in the 1920s. I haven't mentioned the New Deal yet. So you've got a situation where you have more people living in a smaller area, and by 1925, among 14,000 black households citywide, 7,900 were crammed into neighborhoods accounting for 3/5 of a square mile. And so as those neighborhoods became more dense, there was pressure on white landlords and black landlords to cut those houses up, those single-family dwellings, and make apartments out of them. So somebody's going to be missing a bathroom. Somebody's going to be missing a kitchen. And so this stresses city services. If you have more people living in a dwelling that it was built for, that's more trash pickup, right? That's the schools have to account for those children. And so it starts to stress city services. So the rents are higher, the quality goes down, and then the city and the rest of the country start developing this myth of black carelessness. They're like, well, why are people living in these dilapidated housing, in these awful conditions? It's like, did you see what just happened, right? You're creating artificial scarcity. You're creating an apartheid market. And because of the squeeze, credit was scarce. Resources are scarce. Mortgages are scarce. And here's the underside of a segregated banking and insurance market. The Consolidated Bank and Trust Company didn't have the capitalization to handle the demand. Its customers tended to be higher risk borrowers because of apartheid-era education and job discrimination. So you have a population that's not earning their potential because of that job discrimination, the higher risk borrowers. So that falls on the shoulders of black businesses who serve them. White businesses don't have to assume that kind of risk. And so you've got this perilous cycle that's a product of this apartheid system. And a few moments ago, I was celebrating the vibrancy of the black business community. This is still true, but that business community then has to shoulder the effects of segregation. And then the Depression hit. So this is happening before the Great Depression. And we usually read these Homeowners Loan Association maps as causing racial segregation. This is actually reflecting something that's been underway now for almost a generation. And so when the federal government got into the business of guaranteeing loans, they sent out inspectors or kind of partnered with inspectors in every city in the country. Again, property owners associations, local real estate professionals. It wasn't some national board, but it was national priorities that created maps like this. And you can see the outlines of Jackson Ward in red, and those neighborhoods were cut off from credit for having black residents. Those in green were new construction. Those are the places where they've built the walls around white wealth, and that's getting federal aid. And without getting too deep into it, it became government policy to do this. So when the federal government got into the business of backing home ownership and providing those 30-year loans that we love, right? Because you only have to put 20% down versus the old balloon mortgage where you had to put half down, those are all going to white residents. And so instead of just ratifying apartheid or segregation, you're furthering this process of decapitalization among black residents of Richmond and subsidizing white wealth creation by providing those mortgages, guaranteeing those mortgages in what's going to become the suburbs. So you've got all these processes happening at once. Now, I do want to highlight the fact that black Richmonders were not just, sitting around waiting for something to change. People like Louise Mama Harris was among the leaders. A tobacco stemmer, didn't have much of a formal education, but was subject to 90-hour work weeks in dusty, dangerous tobacco factories. She began to organize workers who went on strike, and they got reduced work days, they got higher wages. They were really using the power of the New Deal Acts, the Wagner Act, to achieve some gains. So this is civil rights, this is union organizing in the 1930s. By World War II, black Richmonders are joining the Double V campaign, right? Victory against fascism abroad and racism at home. But once again, when the federal government gets into the business of creating a middle class through the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, we see that those benefits were distributed unequally. So the federal government had local boards, local offices decide who gets the home loans, who gets the business loans, who gets the education benefits under the GI Bill. And so not surprisingly, you had a situation where a white vet might come in to the Richmond board and they'll say, hey, you seem like a smart lad. Why don't you go to University of Virginia and study engineering? Okay, we'll pay for that. Black vet comes in, says, well, you look like a brickmaker. Why don't you go to the veterans school and learn masonry? Okay, what's the wealth consequences of that? What are the income consequences of an engineering degree from UVA or a certificate, a trade certification, right? So this is all happening in the context of the city leaders eyeing ways to now clear the so-called slums that the city created through its generations of apartheid policies. And so in the middle of the 20th century, you have city planners like Bartholomew that are fixing a problem of the city's own making. And this was the the city turned to influential planner Harland Bartholomew to draft a master plan for the redevelopment of the city. And so, unsurprisingly, Bartholomew, which had done this all over the country, the firm had developed master plans for more than 550 cities, including Washington, D.C., including Richmond, Charlottesville, that emphasized clearing properties in black neighborhoods, maintaining segregated housing, and making cities more car-friendly by widening streets and building highways. So remember that old streetcar system that Walker tried to desegregate in 1904? Well, those are being replaced by automobiles. Automobiles have to drive on city streets. Bartholomew's saying, hey, Richmond, you can solve one problem with another. Let's clear out these slum housing, in quotes, put in highways, and Richmond will benefit. Well, we know what happened next. The city targeted Jackson Ward, targeted for several highway construction projects. It tended also to do something that was uncontroversial at the start but had long-term negative wealth consequences, which was to, once you already got an artificially scarce housing market for black Richmonders, let's now tear through those neighborhoods and put in a highway. Where are you going to put the people? So that's when they started suggesting public housing. Now, public housing was not a big deal when it was occupied by white, people who were in the city trying to get their footing, trying to get the jobs so that they could earn the money to get the mortgages, to buy the property out in the suburbs. But Richmond decided to shift the emphasis of public housing to black Richmonders who are displaced by these highway projects. And so what that in effect does is to say, all right, now you're out of the game of getting a home mortgage. You're out of the game of building generational wealth that you can pass down. And you can see why that racial wealth gap gets stuck. The federal government is subsidizing mortgages for white home buyers, while city government is subsidizing public housing that's going to essentially trap people in this cycle. Nobody wants to live in public housing permanently, right? It's a stopgap measure. But through creating this infrastructure, the city was able to kind of make that process happen. So, of course, the white city council is deciding where to put these highways through, and you can see the displacement if we see map upon map, and this shows it rather dramatically. Duval Baker Street, and the 64 highway, the 95-64 highway project. There's West Lee Street there. And so there's there it is today. That's the consequence of this. Now, since 2020, the city has tried to kind of undo the effects of 200 years of this process. We have a Richmond district's map, right, that's supposed to kind of rectify some of the historic injustices. But you can see clearly the legacies there in that in the statistics. These are from 2020, statistics of white households versus black households in Richmond who own. And then if we look at on the right, there's the social vulnerability index. And so it has different metrics, right? Access to medical care, insurance, incomes, quality, air, environmental quality. And if you overlay those two maps, again from 1937, which is reflecting a process that's already in motion, and here from 2020, you can see a little bit of the same process. And I think this following map really lays it out. The map on the left shows racial composition, and you can see the effects of all that redlining, city planning, and then the social vulnerability index. And so the highlights on the left-hand side of the map, and the red are whiter populations, the blue are African American populations. And you can see the social vulnerability index. The green is the higher quality of life, longevity, access to services, medical care, food, cooler temperatures, and then the red is the opposite. So this is the legacy today. And that partially explains why this racial wealth gap is stubbornly stuck at now 6 times, 1 to 6. When the Fed did this survey in 2022, one of the silver linings of the survey was that because of the pandemic-era rise in real estate prices, black homeowners tended to be more wealthy than they had in 2019 when they did the previous survey. But if you read the fine print, you'll notice that incomes were dropping, right? The racial income gap was widening, even as the racial wealth gap was easing a bit. So I wanted to thank you for your kind attention here. I wanted to ask if there are any questions, and then sort of awkwardly on the screen here, I was going to recommend the Jackson Ward Project and the Shako Institute as two places to go, because what we could discuss is what to do about this history, right? How do you rectify this? How do you kind of start to talk about paths towards justice? So let me end there with again, thank you, and ask for your questions.
This is a simple question. Would you give the name again of the woman who was in the tobacco industry who started organizing workers?
Yeah. I want to get this right. Louise Mama, quotes Mama Harris. Yeah, Louise Harris was a remarkable person. You have some other information?
No, I was just wanting to know
Okay.
that. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hello, I actually got a couple questions, but I'll try to do at least once and try to see if there's others. But so I'm from Norfolk. I'm the librarian, local history and genealogist, and archivist for Norfolk Public. So obviously we have a lot of similar history. And I guess some of the things I've been seeing in Norfolk is, for one, did the Catholic Church location have any influence in the building of the community initially?
Yeah, this is a great question. Did the Catholic Church have any influence in the location of the community? I don't know the answer to that, so I'll refer you to someone who knows kind of more of the fine-grained details. But you're mentioning Norfolk. This process happened in just about every city. So even Grand Rapids, Michigan, right, with no history of segregation, no history of racial slavery, was doing the same thing. It boxed the entire black population into like 1/3 of a square mile, and the housing prices went up. And then the city just targeted it. It's happening in Los Angeles. It's happening in Phoenix, right? And even if you're not displaced by an interstate highway, if you own property that's in sight of an on-ramp, right, it's probably not going to rise just like the suburban properties that it serves, that highway serves. So even if you think about people who were not displaced by these highway projects or were not redlined, right? As long as you're adjacent to that. And when this happened in Phoenix, the city decided, we need to attract business to these neighborhoods. And so the businesses they attract tended to be metal fabricating plants, tire recycling plants, things you don't want to live next to, right? Things that are going to make it hard for your children to breathe, things that are going to lower the property values. And so it seems like everything the city does to kind of rectify the problem that it created exacerbates the problem, right? All right, so now I'm talking again. I want to hear from you.
And I guess one of the other things I was noticing too is that the location of if there was Freeman Bureau farms after the war, that it seems down in Norfolk and Princess Anne and such, that some of the neighborhoods that the African Americans developed were basically where some of these farms were located. So I didn't know, again, if it's something similar up here.
Yeah, again, the question about the Freedmen's Farms and the locations of Freedmen's Bureau, I don't know I don't have a good answer to that. All right, one thing that a lot of scholars in my business point to is the high level of black property ownership in Virginia versus South Carolina versus Alabama by 1900. But we usually, the trick with history is where do you start the story and where do you end the story? Because if that high property ownership was reflecting the success of Reconstruction, what happened to those property owners in the next generation? And many lost property in the next generation, including those Freedmen's Farms, just because of these predatory practices, the predatory credit and insurance practices. And then for places, I don't know if this is true for Norfolk, but in coastal South Carolina, all of a sudden people are looking at the beach instead of being a liability because no one wants to raise livestock there. Now they can imagine a second home, right? And so black communities on places like Hilton Head, which was 90% black in 1950, the developers went in, they basically forced the residents out, and then the state decides to build an auto bridge to the island, which materially increases its values. Now you can drive there. So the infrastructure project and this process of decapitalization went hand in hand. You see what I just did there? I took a question and answered what I wanted to, right, to talk about.
Hi, Calvin. It's Rob Nelson. It's been a while.
Rob.
Building on that, because I was thinking of Andrew Carl's work, and I think you might
Yeah.
even be talking about Andrew's
Correct.
example
Andrew
in
Carl
there.
at the University of Virginia. Read his books about the latest one is called The Black Tax. I forget the title of the previous one, but it talks about this process of developing beach waterfront communities that were African American owned, became
Yeah.
white pleasure palaces kind of thing.
And I've been reading, like I read Andrew Carl's work recently, and I'm thinking of some of the work in urban history that I think you're relying upon, and a lot of that's focused on like financialization and financial instruments as a kind
Yeah.
of mechanism and a kind of basis for racial inequality. So that could
Yeah.
be municipal bond markets, that could be property taxes, that could be predatory
Correct.
inclusion, that could be insurance.
Yeah.
And I have a kind of a big, kind of wonky question about racial capitalism, and it kind of seems like what you're kind of suggesting, that the question always becomes like, what do you do about this, right? Like, what
Right.
if racial capitalism is the source of and the foundation for racialized inequality, what's the root out of that? And you really put some emphasis on black capitalism here, and I'm
Yeah.
kind of curious if that's I'm asking you to like kind of a little more conceptualize as to theorize, what you do about
Right.
the interconnection between
Yeah.
racial inequality and capitalism.
Yeah, this is a great question. So black capitalism, I say, is necessary but not sufficient. So what happened in the 1960s is a lot of black power leaders were saying we need separate, we need black capitalism over here to support African American uplift and even separate it from white capitalism. So people like Floyd McKissick were saying this in the late 1960s, and then Richard Nixon latches onto it and goes, oh, that sounds like a great idea, black capitalism. Let's have the next generation of Maggie Walker support the burden of redeveloping these communities. So can you have a segregated money supply? Can you have a segregated school system that functions? You have what if your water was segregated, like the blood banks used to be? So you could say, yes, you need a vibrant, active, community of black capitalists in a city like Richmond or Baltimore or North Charleston. But at the same time, the policymakers tried to then put the burden on those people in Phoenix as well to solve the problems that the city's been making for 100 years. So one of the consequences of this is that when any economic downturn, black banks get squeezed more. And so African American owned banks virtually disappeared in the 1980s and the 1990s. You see the steady decline. And you need black capitalism, but you can't put on those business people's shoulders this project, which is kind of what tends to happen. And I had another point, but I know we're running short on time.
We've got about a few minutes.
Few more minutes, okay. There's a hand in the back.
Sir, I have a question.
Yes.
You touched on John Mitchell and the legendary Maggie Lena Walker, who was the first black woman to run for office. Can you expand upon the Lily Black ticket and the impact and efforts of politics, community activism to resolve the issues during this time?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it kind of goes beyond my depth. So I'm going to have to say, the question is about the Lily Black ticket and the effect of activists like Walker. So I don't know a lot of the grid, the fine grain details. So I'm sorry. I'm out of my depth there. But this was, and again, there's always this push and pull, right? You say, here's segregation, here's apartheid, and then what do you do, right? So you develop black-led, black-owned institutions and businesses, right? But then is that going to turn the corner? And so it in a profound sense, it does, right? Because it recognizes the power, the economic, the political power, and serves as the conscience of a system that's forcing people apart, based on this apartheid system. But again, I'm talking when I should be listening. So I need to listen to the experts on that.
I'm just wondering two questions about Harlan Bartholomew that you mentioned. I've never heard his name before. Could you just elaborate a little bit more? I mean, he must have really made a lot of money if he was working for 500
Yeah.
American cities. So
Right.
that's one thing.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
secondly, where do you go to get the primary source material? Where are the archives for Harlan Bartholomew's company? And what's the name of the company even?
Yeah, that's another great question that's a little bit out of my depth. So what I do know about Harlan Bartholomew is it is a consulting service, before there was such a thing as consulting, right? Think McKinsey Company, right? What is McKinsey going to tell you if you go to it and say, well, I need you to help me make my business more profitable? Well, you need to fire people and do more with less, right? This is the kind of thing. So Bartholomew had this great plan that he preached all over the country, which was you take the results of this apartheid system, you actually look for the vulnerable neighborhoods, the people that can't push back politically, and steamroll them and put the interstate highways through them, redevelop the city, based on kind of socializing the risk on those communities. So that was the pattern that went through Bartholomew's business plan. But I want to stress, and I don't want to exculpate Bartholomew, but if you look at any mid-century, big mid-century project like Levittown, the authors of Levittown envisioned this as a segregated community. This is, the developers all over the country tended to act with one accord. So I'm sorry, again, great question. It's a little bit out of my depth, but the part of the Bartholomew pattern was shared by many others.
Some of
Via
the
VCU.
Bartholomew records are at VCU,
Yeah.
and then some are at the WashU. They're there too. And then the city of Richmond has its separate plan for Harlan Bartholomew that you can check out here.
Okay, in talking about that early black capitalism here, certainly there were some individually owned businesses as well as professional people like doctors and so forth. But the groups that Maggie Walker and John Mitchell were involved with were very large organizations, and in setting up something like a bank, it was not a typical bank structure. It was based on the small contributions of a large number of people.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking that one of the strengths of that time period was that particular approach, and that might very well be something that could be possible now, maybe with a different kind of focus, one that was multiracial, but that took it out of the realm of everything falling on their shoulders, but took advantage of the strength of many people being behind an economic institution.
Yeah. This is a tough knot to untie, right? So when you're asked the question about present day banking in this fashion, I'm thinking of the Greenwood Bank, which was started in Atlanta, to do exactly this. But the problem that the founders of the Greenwood Bank ran into was the bar to get a state charter, to actually charter a bank, is really high, and it's really expensive. So this is one of the reasons behind banking consolidation, right? So your Wells Fargo or your Bank of America that's gobbled up Wachovia and all the other smaller banks, which in turn have gobbled up community banks, is that you're competing against behemoths whose model really relies on a lot of wealth passing through the doors and a lot of fees collected. So the banking model we have today rewards people who pay their balances every month with perks and points and all kinds of goodies, and relies on its revenue on poorer people, right, who have to pay the fees to keep the accounts and pay the overdrafts. And have you ever been hit with these? What's your credit card interest rate? If you pay it off every month, you don't care. But if you have to carry a balance. And so the kind of banking, what I'm getting to is the kind of banking that Maggie Walker excelled at is very hard to do today. The bar in some senses was lower in the late 19th, early 20th century. The capitalization and so forth. Plus the operating costs. I mean, again, those fees, every time you walk into a bank, the bank hits you with a fee. If you're serving customers who are depositing nickels and pennies and keeping small balances, your overhead is really high because you have to serve those customers, right? They're going to come in and they'll deposit 10 cents one week, but then they're going to withdraw 5 cents the next week. But you have to have the staff that are willing to do that, and it's hard to make money off of that. And also, if you're securing loans on properties that are in the path of demolition, right, the collateral is shaky. So it's the founders of Greenwood Bank in Atlanta found that very difficult to do. So much so that the people accuse them of fraud and saying, you're just trying to kind of make money off of Black Atlantans the same way that the white-owned banks are doing it, because you're in fact a platform and you're riding off the charter of a Washington state bank that is white-owned. And so there's lots of complications there. I like the idea. All right. Thank you so much.